Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast. This is episode 390 and it also marks the start of our 10th season covering MotoGP as a podcast. The goal of the Paddock Pass podcast has always been to get you all the inside news and views from the paddock, and hopefully throughout this 10th season we're going to be able to do that once again. As ever, we have boots on the ground in the desert. Adam and Neil are just back from Qatar. David, you're back to writing your 10,000 word wrap-ups from each weekend, so it's business as usual. And let's kick it off straight to you, Ad, because you're just back from Qatar. What was your grade for the weekend and your overall feeling from the first round?
Just back. Well, I got back from Qatar on Monday night, Steve, so I'm only halfway through day's roundup so far. It will now be Wednesday morning.
From Thursday.
It was obviously good to start the season again, and especially at the Lusail International Circuit. Of course, it's very Marmite. There are people that love it and people that hate it. I quite like the Grand Prix. You asked for grades, so I'll get straight into it. I'll say a 7 out of 10. I think we have to be a little bit more controlled on our grades and ratings this year. I think we dished out a few 8 and 9s in 2023, perhaps when they weren't merited. Perhaps we should be a little bit more demanding with our scores. I think, you have to credit the Qataris. They go all in for MotoGP. I mean, there's advertising around Doha. It's a signature event. They've added Formula One and the FIA World Endurance to the schedule at Lusail International Circuit as well now. So MotoGP is sort of part of a flowering kind of portfolio of motorsport events. And the only thing I will say is I think it used to be a bit of a big deal for the country, whereas now in the post-FIFA World Cup landscape, MotoGP seems like a little bit more of a niche sport again. It won the best Grand Prix in 2023 and, it seemed busy again. And what I will say, having walked around sort of the commercial area behind the main grandstand where everybody congregates, is that the people are really into it. I mean, there is sort of a real passion for MotoGP. And that's, one of the strengths of the race, even though it is, as we know, extremely peculiar and very much like an anomaly on the calendar. But I'll say a 7 out of 10 because we got some fantastic races in Moto2 and Moto3. It's a little bit more formulaic in MotoGP, but Lusail is the most modern circuit on the calendar. And it was just good to get things underway in very nice hot sunshine.
Yeah, I did like the start of the Pirelli era for Moto2 and Moto3. It definitely gave us something a little bit different. But Neil, what about you? What was your grades and your feelings from the paddock?
Yeah, very similar to Ad. Not really a great deal to add to what Ad has already said, to be honest. There was the place has had a total facelift since 2023. Obviously, we experienced that last year as well. It's a really high tech, impressive facility to go to nowadays. Moto2, Moto3 were great. MotoGP was all right, but there were some really interesting things that were going on, and it was lit up largely by one rider who I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. So I'm going to go for a 6.
And Dave, what about you?
As me, Adam wanted us to be much more reasonable our grades, then I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 because MotoGP is back, baby. And that's really the most important thing. And the reason it isn't a 10 out of 10 is because it was at Qatar, which is horrible.
So we're going to just get 10s from you for the whole season, Dave.
No. Only for the first one, because it's MotoGP back. It's only back once. Then after that, it's just
a slog.
Yes, it's just. I wasn't going to say that, but yes.
I'll tell you what, you can't say that, Dave. You're already in Portimao ahead of round 2, so you're super excited for round 2 as well. So that's definitely going to be high up in your list as well. I would say one thing, Ad. It always reminds me of. This is a 5-star movie. A 5-star movie has to be perfect. I could watch it a million times and still enjoy it. And, a 9, 10 out of 10 Grand Prix needs to be a little bit like that as well. So I'm happy enough with a 7 or thereabouts for this round. We're back in Qatar, we're back racing, and we had the excitement of Acosta and some other things in it as well. But I will say one thing. We had a lot of excitement during the races from Pedro. We probably didn't have as much excitement as it was for Chad Johnson. Chad won our Patreon competition, and he's got 2 paddock passes to a Grand Prix later in the season. So I've reached out to Chad, and hopefully we hear back before the next show, and we'll be able to tell everyone which Grand Prix they can be very jealous of Chad for being able to get a paddock pass to. So thanks very much, Chad, and thanks very much to everyone that entered the competition. It does make a big difference to us. So sign up on patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast if you want to become a Paddock Insider.
Steve, when did the Paddock Pass podcast become a fake podcast? I think Dave's been replaced by a bot or some kind of AI generated image, because having a 9 out of 10 this early in the season is very disturbing.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's wait and see what other disturbing things David Emmett says through the rest of the show, and we'll just see just how inaccurate an AI bot for a podcast really can be.
I'm only just getting warmed up.
Oh my goodness. The one thing that wasn't too inaccurate over the weekend was the predictions that Ducati were going to dominate. Double win for Ducati. It was a perfect race from Pecco Bagnaia on Sunday. Really impressive in the sprint race from Jorge Martin as well. So Ducati able to claim both race victories. Brad Binder finished second in both races, and a very strong start to the year for the KTM rider. And speaking of KTM, the company have just revamped the Duke naked bike range for 2024. This is the 30th anniversary of their concept, and the 990 Duke is currently the must-have or must-try model. So get down to any KTM stockist, because the 990 Duke not only ticks many of the boxes for any rider, it rips them apart. And Adam, I do know for a fact that Gordon Ritchie on the Superbike pod has been very keen to see if there's any way for him to be able to get a little bit of a rip out on one of those. So we'll have to see about that at some stage. But Ad, we'll move on to you for moments of the weekend. What was your big moment?
We've mentioned his name already, Steve, but I'm going to say Pedro Acosta's move on Marc Marquez. There was quite an amusing comment afterwards where, Pedro likened the experience to losing his virginity. I kind of have to agree with him there from personal experience. Not in overtaking Marc Marquez, but more the rites of passage that comes with that sort of activity.
Don't pretend you've lost yours.
Yes.
He's got 2 kids.
Acosta, what a performance. He set the fastest lap of the race. He overtook Marc, I think it was mid-race, lap 11 or 12 of 21. And there was something kind of symbolic there. We were watching his progress and we thought, go on, pass him. Marquez is 12 years older. Though, maybe it's too much to say it was a passing of the baton. But, the fact that Acosta could do everything like this on his debut was probably the most visual treat, I think, from the Grand Prix itself. So that was my moment.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting listening to Acosta afterwards as well, Ed, because like you said, there was that comment that got a lot of traction everywhere, but his comments about the actual racing was probably even more interesting whenever he was saying that coming into the season, it was a big question mark from how he was going to react in a race. And then on the run down to turn 1, suddenly he realised everything's different and he had to focus on what everyone else was doing. And the sprint had a different mentality. The feature length race had a difference as well for him. So I thought it was interesting to see how his mindset was during the weekend. But Dave, what about you? What was your moment of the weekend?
Well, my moment of the weekend was actually the Moto2 race, and especially the last sort of lap where...
this is doing nothing to discount Ad thinking that you're an AI bot now.
The Moto2 race turned out to be really interesting precisely because of the Pirellis. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but, like Barry Baltus, a name, Barry has shown real sort of flashes of being really, really quick. But he never seemed to be able to get it done. And he just rode a superb race, came up just short on Alonso Lopez. Alonso Lopez rode a fantastic race as well. And I genuinely enjoyed the Moto2 race. And I think Pirelli is going to be very good for Moto2, not so much for Moto3, because the Moto3 race was a Moto3 race. There was 12 million people all trying to overtake each other, Moto2 really enjoyed it.
Dave, does this newfound fandom of Moto2 mean you'll be listening to Neil in the depths of Moto2 FP2 during the weekend?
I always listen to Neil.
I always ignore Neil, I think is what you meant to say. Neil, what about you? What was your moment of the weekend?
Well, Dave's plumped for Moto2. I'm going to plump for the last lap of the Moto3 race. I think Dave was maybe a little sparing in his praise of the action, but it was a pretty exciting end. And David Alonso's last lap was my highlight. Started the lap 8th, I think, or he was 8th on the run down to turn 1, and somehow managed to be in a place where he could just pass Danny Holgado for the lead at the final turn and just hold him off. So, that was pretty remarkable. Didn't think he had the best pre-season. Was maybe a little on the back foot compared to some of the other top KTM guys that were maybe more fancied runners. But Alonso showed that he still has that sort of killer instinct on the last lap, which is going to stand him in good stead for this year. Yeah,
I thought the Moto3 race in general was quite an interesting one. I know Dave will obviously discount the first 95% of the race, but I thought, Neil, when you look at the fields this year, obviously there's always a little bit of a question mark on who's going to step up. But I thought Furasado gave us something that was good to see, a rider that coming into the championship last year, everyone thought might well be a little bit special. Alonso, Halgado, we know they're going to be strong all the way through the year. So Moto3 looks like it could be pretty interesting for you through the season.
One thing about Moto3, there seemed to be a lot of crashes, a lot more crashes than I remember from watching it with the Dunlop. So, I think was one of the things where you saw the biggest difference between the Pirellis and the Dunlops, where riders were just managing to fling themselves off for no reason.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things for the change to Pirellis as well, Dave, because this is going to be obviously something that changes everything for the teams and the riders and how they have to set their bikes up. But I think Moto3 would be interesting to see how quickly it takes them to adapt to the tyre, because it's a very different concept. Moto2, we saw a lot of big incidents as well. We obviously saw all the excitement during the race of riders falling down the order, and guys that we expected to be quick were struggling. Guys that we expected to be in the mid-pack were coming through to the fore. And a big reason for that is just trying to understand the tyres. The concept of a Pirelli is so different to pretty much any other racing tyre. And we always have it every time a MotoGP rider comes to Superbike, they need to reset their whole mindset, because the hotter it gets, the softer you go with the Pirelli, as opposed to pretty much every tyre that most riders have ever ridden, where you're always going harder and harder the hotter the temperature goes. That's why we end up racing an awful lot with the X tyre as effectively our race tyre, even though that was originally designed only to be a 10-lap sprint race tyre.
Yeah, the reason that a softer tyre doesn't get worn as much is because it grips. Quite often a harder tyre will spin, and that will actually sort of consume the tyre a lot more, and you end up wearing them out a lot more. Whereas a softer tyre will give you more drive grip for longer, because it's not wearing out so much, and it's actually driving and digging in. But when it runs out, it tends to drop off more quickly. But tyres are absolutely fascinating and never work the way that you think they do.
Yeah, the one thing I would say for the Pirelli, always keep an eye on the track temperature, because if it's like 25 degree or lower, that's when you'll use the harder tyre. That's why I was really surprised whenever I saw so many riders go for the SC1 rear tyre in the Moto2 race, because everyone from Superbikes immediately just texting each other about the tyres. Everyone said that's going to be too hard a tyre for this. But let's move it on to our talking points from the weekend. And keeping it in alphabetical order, we'll start with you, Ad.
Yes, Steve, I think I just wanted to address how the Qatar GP showed some riders are ready, some riders are not, some are very much work in progress. And this may touch on some of our observations later in the podcast. But, if you start with the good, then obviously Pecco Bagnaia pretty much engaged his 2023 MO by being slightly concerning on Friday, getting things sorted on Saturday, and then being, a level or reaching a sort of sustained period of superiority on Sunday to take the main result. That was actually Bagnaia's first opening race win from 6 seasons. So it's, I think it was a powerful statement when it came to the 21 laps. Of course, it was supposed to be 22, but then we had that incident on the start grid, which incidentally, Aleix Espargaro didn't want to comment on. So he obviously had some strong views. After the media debrief, he kind of looked at me and said, kind of what I want to say, but I can't. So I think he had read the memo from IRTA about comments on certain issues that riders are now they have to be certainly careful in what they say.
He wasn't that careful about his comments about the tyre, Ad.
Yeah, that was a little bit more on the fringe, I think. But yeah, you mentioned Brad Binder earlier, Steve, and Binder, for the second time at Lusail finished second. He's second in the World Championship for the second time in his career. So that was a great start of 2-2, best overall scorecard, I think you could say, if we're looking at it in terms of motocross overalls. And then Jorge Martin, the ultimate sprint king. That's 10 victories now. That's almost a rate of 50% if you take in the last season and the beginning of the concept. But on the other end of the scale, I think, maybe Dave will agree with me slightly. There's still question marks over how riders are using the GP23 in the Ducati stable and making it work. Marco Bezzecchi, perhaps the most obvious example of someone still trying to get the setting and the feeling right with the electronics. Augusto and Jack from the RC16, they really still need to refine their setup. whereas, there are two riders who are maximizing it at the moment. And then if you look towards like Aprilia, then you have Maverick Vinales and Miguel Oliveira with the RS GP24 that also are still sort of work in progress. And then when we come to the Japanese, then that's a whole other ball, really. And Bezzecchi sort of laughed a little bit in his debrief on Sunday night when I asked him how it felt to be playing in the Japanese Cup in the second half of the field. I think Bezzecchi started in 17th and obviously didn't rise many more positions than that. I think he finished 14th, got a couple of points for his work, but I think we expected a bit more from one of the breakthrough acts of 2023 and someone we thought would be potentially an outsider bet for the championship this year. So it's just a nice kind of narrative stream through the MotoGP pack of people being in places where they should be and others where you think, wow, come on, lads, get a move on.
I thought it was quite interesting, Bezzecchi in particular, because he is the perfect example of someone that wasn't ready for the start of the season, and it's very similar, obviously, to what happened to Bastianini last year, and that not a coincidence that they're both on that GP23. And like you mentioned that this is the first round. It's very easy to draw far too many conclusions from Qatar. We need to wait until we get 3, 4, 5 rounds into the season. But it's also very difficult not to look at certain situations. The Japanese manufacturers, what's Quartararo going to do? You mentioned about Miller as well. What's going to happen with him when you've Acosta so strong in the opening round? Suddenly, you've got riders and manufacturers under a lot of pressure to be able to perform when we get to Portimao for round 2.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing about Qatar is they have had 2 days of test there, so it is a little bit more representative. Portimao will be interesting because, as you say, like no one's got any data. No one knows what the hell's going to go on. Then we go to Austin, which is weird, and which they've resurfaced chunks of as well, I think. Turn 2 where Pecco fell off last year. And then we get back to Jerez, and then we'll start to get to see where things really are. But I do think Qatar it's sort of representative, but it's also for a lot of teams and especially manufacturers, it's sort of like a base market. So you say, okay, right, so that's where we really are.
Yeah, and it was kind of the sort of the hierarchy that we saw in pre-season. Ducati maybe not quite in a position of strength like last year, still ridiculously strong and the favourites to win everything this year. But I think there was definitely enough in KTM's performance over the weekend, Brad Binder and Pedro Acosta's performance, and Aleix Espargaro's performance up until Sunday's feature race to suggest that they can be regular thorns in the side. Pecco was pretty imperious on Sunday. But he was imperious mostly because he was able to get to the front on the very first lap and sort of dictate the race on his own terms. He wasn't able to do that in the sprint and then really had to suffer because, once again, front tire pressures were an issue in that kind of group. And for Pecco on Saturday, rear tire pressure was also an issue as well, which caused a bit of rear chattering. So once he was able to get out front and sort of dictate the pace in his terms, he could run the race that he wanted. But yeah, Brad Binder was interesting after Sunday's race, saying that he's close, he's really close, but still he feels that he's absolutely on the limit to achieve what he's doing. Whereas he feels the likes of Bagnaia, Martin, they're just able to pull out that extra couple of % whenever they absolutely have to. So he feels that's the difference, and he still feels that Ducati just have that slight edge.
Dave, you and I talked about this a little bit on Sunday evening for the Paddock Note show, but the Japanese factories, Honda and Yamaha, was it perhaps a little unrealistic to expect them to be better than this?
Yes, and yet there is still a sense of optimism there, especially sort of among the Honda riders. I also heard that, Yamaha know how deep a hole they're in, and I think to an extent, Yamaha's problem is that they wanted lots and lots of power to keep up with the Ducatis. They've got the power, but then the rear just spins and spins. uses up the tyre. You're not getting any drive. You're not actually being able to accelerate the way that the Ducatis can. So they've lost what was their strongest point. The Hondas, it's a completely new concept, and they're sort of like working forward. And yes, I think it looks worse on paper than it is, but it is a reality check. Like it really is right. Okay, so we are this far back. I think Fabio Quartararo in particular was quite a long way back. And even though I think he was still something like, I worked out somewhere, 7 seconds faster, I think this year than last year. The trouble is that Pecco was 17 seconds faster, and that's their problem in a nutshell.
We all picked Pecco Bagnaia as our tip for the World Championship in our preview pod. Are we still quite unshakable in that belief after round 1 of 21?
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, but I think his entire package, I would say, is the strongest as it stands. But I add the caveat in that there's 20 runs and 40 races still to go. So yeah, there's ample opportunity for the guy that finished 4th on Sunday to get everything together and to make a concerted challenge. But yeah, I think Pecco's probably the pick still.
I think Pecco is the man to beat. I mean, he is the person you have to beat if you want to be champion. But I think, and we'll come on to this later, but I think there is someone who is capable of beating him. I think there are a couple of riders who may be capable of beating him.
Well, I have to say, I saw that Jorge Martin got pushed out to 3-1 after the weekend, and I decided that I want some of that because I just still like Martin. I think he's got that speed. It's going to play a big factor. Pecco did exactly what Pecco's done for the last 2 years, and you have to take your hat off and say they made a step Friday into Saturday, focused on making sure that they were strong on the Sunday. But I like the look of Jorge Martin. Probably I like the look of 3-1 more than I like the look of Martin in a straight up fight. But I'd be a little bit confident on Martin, and then obviously you have to wait and see what else happens, but we'll have more riders in the mix. I thought it was interesting that both Grassini riders with the old bike were as strong as they were. Alex was able to make the tyre last quite well in the sprint race, and then obviously Mark was strong all the way through the weekend. So that bodes well for them as well. So I think there's more riders in the mix at the front, but I think that Martin, just with that raw pace, I'll fancy his chances. Just when you look at some riders that, David, you mentioned there about Honda, just to finish off very quickly in this before we move on to your talking points. But when you look at Honda, you said it looks better on paper than it really was. Where can anyone cling to a bit of hope for Luca Marini? Because this was a disastrous weekend, really. When you look at Jack Miller has his crash in the Sunday race and still comes through pretty quickly to come past on Marini, and then Marini's just commenting about the fact that he wanted to see what the KTM was like. That's not what you need to hear as a factory team whenever you've got this rider that you've put a lot of hope into being able to come in and really help move the project on.
Yeah, but I mean, Honda still love Luca because of his feedback. He's fantastic. I mean, like, he had a terrible race because he said he had an unspecified technical problem, which usually means something with electronics or something like that. And yeah, but I think Joan Mir was also quite a lot faster this year, despite the the position, like he's fighting with Fabio for a top 10 position, and like I say, I mean, I wasn't there, I couldn't see their faces, but they sounded optimistic. You can actually, when you listen to what the riders have to say, you can actually hear in their voices a lot more than what they're showing on their faces, sort of thing. And there still is a general sense of optimism, but also realism. Like they know they're not going to be champions this year, but they just want to be sort of like fighting for top 5 again.
Well, Dave, there was a moment when, Joan came into the press center on Saturday and there weren't any laces in his shoes. So we were slightly concerned. But other than that, yeah, you're right.
Well, let's move on to Dave, your big talking point from the weekend.
Well, you said you asked who can challenge Pecco Bagnaia for the championship, and it's Marc Marquez.
7-1 on Marc, by the way, Dave.
I would go for. I mean, 7-1 on Marc is fantastic odds because Marc Marquez is working to a plan. First of all, the most interesting statistic is Marc Marquez's crash total for 2024 is currently 0. He has crashed, but only in the test. But he hasn't crashed during the race. He didn't crash during practice. He doesn't need to. He's still working on it. He was saying, I dug out a quote here. He said, like I did on the preseason, solid days, try to not exaggerate, try to not make any mistakes, try to be calm in all situations, don't be crazy. Keep going with my style. I want to be patient this year. He has a plan. Marc Marquez has a plan to genuinely be champion, and the way that he is doing it is by taking it one race at a time, almost one session at a time, to figure out how to ride this to get this better, and to end up with fifth in the sprint race and a fourth in the main race, and to get quite close to the podium towards the end is a sign that I think this was the weekend that he understood that being champion is going to be possible. You're not going to see him at the start of the season, but he knows that by the end of the season, he's going to be really, really strong. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens at Portimao once they get to a track where they've got no data and he's got no experience. That's going to tell us a lot as well. But yeah, I think this was quite ominous. Despite, if you just look at the results, fifth and fourth, you think, oh, that's it, he's out of the championship. But I think that is badly misjudging it.
Dave, I think both you and Mark are quite slippery with the truth. I mean, one moment you're advocating Moto2 and talking about Barry Baltus, and then Marc Marquez is sitting in a press conference saying he just wants to be competitive, he just wants to aim for the top 6, and suddenly there he is fighting for the podium. I think when Simon Crafar, our friend and colleague, mentioned in pre-season testing that Mark might have been sandbagging a little bit at Malaysia, we thought that might be something of a stretch when it comes to performance and suitability with the Ducati, but maybe he is hedging his bet slightly in terms of stretching the limits of performance. Like you say, he didn't crash. He's got a big fat 0 in that column or that statistic for the year so far. But he did mention in his media debrief on Sunday to us that he believes round 2 is going to be much more like a baptism of fire, I think is what he said in Spanish, because he will be going to a circuit where he has no data, no understanding, and it's going to be a much more severe test of how quickly he can get up to speed with the GP23. We know Austin is one of his playgrounds, so that could be a very interesting race to see. But Portimao could be a lot tougher. That could be one where he actually is fighting to be inside the top 6, and then if he's miles off, then your kind of prediction that he's in for the title might be slightly in danger.
I think the big thing for Mark that will sort of work in his favour is the gaps to the victor over the weekend. I mean, in his first race weekend for Ducati, he was 1.8 seconds off in the sprint behind Martin in 5th position, and then 3.5 seconds off the following day, or just under 3.5 seconds off. I mean, those are not big margins. In Qatar, when both races were as ridiculously fast as they were, the sprint was 11 seconds quicker than last year's sprint in Qatar. I think obviously we had a lap less in the feature race because of Ralph Fernandez on the grid, but I think the pace was roughly 0.8 of a second quicker per lap. So it was a really, really fast race. We had Pecco doing his absolute maximum, and Mark wasn't a million miles away in his first race. So I think it's that combined with what Dave said, that he's in a situation where he's not having to risk loads and he's still finding his feet. I think it's a really, really solid start. And the thing is that he has great experience doing this kind of thing. In his days at Honda, there were several seasons when he went into the season knowing it wasn't a great package. I think back to 2016, the first year of the Michelins, he knew that the bike was a dog at the start of the season and it was just about collecting points, and that's kind of what he continued to do through the year. And he ended up champion. So he has experience of using this approach. And I think not spectacular, definitely in the shade of the 3 podium guys and Acosta, but considering Qatar is nowhere near one of his favourite tracks, it's a solid start.
Yeah, I mean, he has a plan, and to me, the key word there is about being patient. He says he's being patient. he's not thinking at all about the first four or five races. He's thinking about the last sort of 7 or 8 races. That's where he's going to make the difference. You know, we're going to go to Aragon. We're going to go to Phillip Island. We're going to go to places where he is really, you know, we're going to go to Sachsenring. He knows that there are places where he has a much stronger chance of actually showing what he's capable of. And he doesn't want to ruin it by crashing, hurting himself, messing things up in the early part of the season. You know, you win, like you say, 20 races to go. There's a lot of racing still left.
Yeah, a lot of racing still left. And Adam, I noticed in the background, there's a Fly Racing helmet there as well. And Fly Racing, of course, obviously supporting us on the Paddock Pass podcast once again this year. And a nice T-shirt there as well, lad. So Fly have lots of apparel and protection for street riding. So helmets, jackets, footwear, gloves, luggage, rain gear, anything you need. So check out flyracing.com for all of that. Neil, we've obviously touched on it a few times during the course of the podcast so far. But what was your big moment of the weekend?
Well, my big talking point of the weekend, Steve, was I think probably the takeaway from the Grand Prix, which was the immediate impact of Pedro Acosta in MotoGP. He's someone that we've talked about throughout pre-season, and I have to admit that I have not been at the tests and not really been able to speak to the kind of engineers that are working with Pedro. I couldn't see a situation where he would do something like he did in Qatar. But the fact that he was so competitive, the fact that he set the fastest lap of the Grand Prix on Sunday and fought through from, I think, 10th on the first lap up until 4th at one point. I mean, it was astonishing stuff. It was probably the most impressive debut that we've seen in the class since Marc Marquez back in 2013. And, you know, just hearing a few tidbits from different people, some engineers. We're going to hear from his crew chief, Paul Trevathan. I managed to catch up with him on Sunday night in a little minute. But just hearing what people are saying about Acosta, it makes you realize that he's doing quite astonishing things. And we could see that on Sunday, you know, the manner in which he overtook the guys, you know, in the top 6 was just brilliant. And he did not look at any point out of place among that sort of MotoGP elite. You know, he looked as if he had been riding and racing against them for years and years. And I know that he obviously benefited from the fact that he had 2 previous days of testing in Qatar, so he had sort of learned the track on a MotoGP machine, got up to speed in that regard. But it was still a remarkable performance. And I had mentioned him passing Marc was the highlight, the moment of his GP. You know, the whole media centre broke out into a round of applause when that happened, just because it was like, can you believe this kid? Can you believe the sort of the temerity to just sort of shrug his shoulders and say, I don't care who this is up ahead of me. I don't care about the reputation. And Dave and I were messaging each other after the sprint. He looked genuinely quite pissed off where he finished in the sprint race. You know, I think he was 8th on Saturday. It wasn't necessarily the best performance, but it was still perfectly acceptable, perfectly fine for a rookie. But he looked really phased. And then a day later, he was just delighted with how that main race went. Yes, he burnt up his tires and he went backwards towards the end, but you could just see that he absolutely loved being up there amongst the leading guys in the class. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it this year. So fantastic stuff, fantastic performance on the track. And I think, like you said at Sepang, Dave, fantastic performance off. It was just giving us constant sound bites and headlines, you know, from his first debrief until his last on Sunday.
You know, you mentioned, you know, that we're going to see a lot more of this. I don't disagree, but do we have to be a bit careful because this was a Grand Prix where Acosta I think he racked up more laps than everybody in the second day of the Qatar test. You know, that if there was a place to start his campaign, then this was the one. You know, he was clearly comfortable. Also, obviously, we made a fantastic Moto3 debut here a couple of years ago as well. Perhaps Portimao is going to be a real, like we said with Marquez, a completely sort of different kettle of fish for him.
Yeah, I think there'll be tough races coming up. But I also think there'll be tracks that when we get back to Europe, he could be maybe showing similar performances to what he did in Qatar. And I think one of the stats that stands out was the fact that he set the fastest lap of the race. If you look at the kind of the riders and their fastest laps, it was pretty much the order in which they finished. You know, Pecco was the second fastest. I think Binder was the third, Martin the fourth, and Marquez under that, and so on. But Acosta had obviously, you know, thrown a bit of caution to the wind and decided, you know what, I just want to fight with these guys. I don't care about my rear tire life for the majority of the race. And it's only very, very special riders that are able to be that fast in their first ever Grand Prix race. I mean, Martin Rains did a great stat on Twitter yesterday. He's the youngest ever rider in history to set a fastest lap off a Premier Class race. You think back to some of the guys that have set the fastest lap in their first ever Premier Class race, and it's a pretty heady roll call of genuine class. I mean, Rossi did it in South Africa in 2000, Marc did it in Qatar 2013, Fabio Quartararo did it in Qatar as well in 2019. So yeah, he's kind of joined a very special band of riders to have achieved that feat.
Yeah, and the best thing about it was, like, nobody's told him that it's really hard to overtake in MotoGP, because he was just overtaking at will. I think that shows that there is something very, very special going on, and there will be up and down. I'm not sure about Portimao, because obviously, like, you know, he raced in the Spanish Championship, he's raced in Red Bull Rookies, so he knows the track.
And he's amazing.
I think he could be quite well. Yeah.
I mean, he won every race, I think, and he did in the junior classes there, with the exception.
There you go.
Maybe with the
Write it down, Pedro Acosta to win the Portimao.
I also like to point out something that Neil brought up a moment ago, just how Acosta has this habit of tossing asides and being quite, what's the word, extravagant, flamboyant, I don't know, away from the motorcycle. I mean, it's something that is completely refreshing. I mean, even during his debrief, he would look around under sort of Matilda Poncharal, sort of the press officer for Tech 3, and say, we're doing a good job, aren't we? You know, just there's a real awareness of playing to the crowd. And, you know, for somebody who's only a year older than my eldest son, which still freaks me out, I can't quite believe, you know, that he's riding and racing like this, but also able to sort of mold the whole fuss around him. I asked him about this, actually, I think it was on Saturday after the sprint, just saying, you know, are you ready for all the kind of attention and all the fuss to build up and go even more crazy, because people are going to start saying, you know, that you're already a next generational talent, but now they're going to say that you're on the way, you're firmly going to be a superstar of this sport. And he just kind of sort of shook his head and said, look, it means nothing. It means nothing. And that wasn't him just batting away the comment. I think he actually has a good group around him, a family around him, and, you know, we've said this before, but he seems to be freakily mature and kind of down to earth, and you think those kind of attributes are going to hold him in good stead. And the last person who was kind of like that was a certain Italian, and we know the kind of impact he had on the sport and then transcended it. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I interviewed him in Sepang for a Dutch magazine called Kickstart, and one of the things I asked him about this, and he sort of like said, look, there's after winning that first race in Qatar, being in the press conference in Jerez in his first season in Moto3, he said, like, I think he said, basically, after winning that first race in Qatar, I had to get a new phone because the other one basically caught fire from the number of messages that was that he had. He had, and at the time he was still only 16, I think. He had so much pressure at that time, and that was why he also said that was why his start to the second year or his first Moto2 season was so difficult, because he'd let it all get to his head, and that was he said that year was his most difficult season in motorcycle racing, because he put so much more expectations on himself. So I think he's already been through the hype cycle. He understands the hype cycle, and he's not letting it get to him. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what happens, if he can still manage it, because it is a lot of pressure. But he does seem very, very very grounded. But he does, you know, to come back to the Rossi comparisons, I just wish he spoke like literally a fraction better English. His English is very good, but you know that if his English was a fraction better, he'd just be absolutely perfect here. You know, in terms of as a racer, in terms of as a personality, in terms of you know, his ability to make a quip, he's just absolute box office.
May I remind you of his age, Dave? 19 years and 290 days. So give it another couple of months, and I'm sure his English will have taken a pretty substantial step up.
Yeah, if I was Albert Valera, the thing that I'd give him to do over the winter next year is just, like an intensive English lesson, because he would benefit from it. And he will, he's going to be speaking English. We've seen this with Mark as well. Start of the season, his English is a bit rubbish, and then by the end of it, it's much better because he's had to spend the whole of the season speaking English.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what you were saying there, Dave. And his very brief time in the smaller classes seems to have prepped him remarkably well for what is expected of him in MotoGP. But a couple of just standout quotes. I think my favorite one was on Saturday, where he said, I asked him the difference between riding MotoGP Sprint and Moto2, and he was like, "Well, it's great. You don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to worry about tire life or fuel conservation or anything like that. You just put on your balls and go," which I thought was a pretty decent quote for how MotoGP Sprint should be approached. And just one other thing, I mentioned how comfortable he looked in the kind of the thick of the battle at the start of the races. He looked, there was no obvious weak point, like when he was having to go for very fast laps in practice or in qualifying, he was able to kind of magically pull them out of the bag, and it just seemed like every situation he was in over the weekend. It was a very stressful Saturday where you had practice in the morning, which determined qualifying, and then you had qualifying, and then you had the sprint, and it was just remarkable, how he was, I think, 6th in practice, then 8th in qualifying, all sort of high pressure stakes where he had to perform. He was able to do it.
It seems like we're having a few connection issues with Steve on the podcast. So, Steve, if you can hear us, then jump back in at any time. But listen, let's move on to the Fantasy League, the Alpine Stars Paddock Pass podcast, special league that we have set up. There's 700 people now involved. Who among us is currently top? Who has bragging rights so far? Dave, are you in the top half?
I am in the top half. Let me just bring it up. I am 180 out of 752. That's still not quite near the top, but the sprint race saved me because I had Fabio Di Giannantonio. He managed to crash out in the first half.
Damn it, that's 22 positions better than me. I don't understand how that's possible. I selected Bagnaia and Binder as my gold riders, and they finished 1-2. And then as silver, I had Aleix Espargaro, which looked incredibly promising after the sprint, and then Pedro Acosta. I thought that would be a bit of a dream team. I was feeling very, very content and smug on Saturday, thinking I'm quids in. But then, before we start to, I'm going to deny you a moment of glory here, Dave, and go straight to Neil. Where are you, Neil?
Very smug. That doesn't sound like you had.
Never.
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of interesting story. I'll try and keep it short. Basically, Steve has very kindly lent me his login for the World Superbike website. So I was watching the Phillip Island races with Steve's login. For some reason, the Dorna mainframe thought that when I was picking my fantasy team, it was Steve. So my team...
Basically, you picked Steve's team.
Sabotage.
I did. Yeah, you could say I sabotaged Steve's team because it might have been even better had I not done this. But it was only on Saturday when I checked the leagues after the sprint that I realized my team name was Steve English. And I was like, oh, God. So then I realized that I had to do my fantasy over the phone. And by that stage, it was obviously too late. So I'm actually currently 725th with 0 points. What a tit. So that'd be a warning. If you're using someone else's login for the video pass, then it might play up with your fantasy. So I'm already on the back foot. I am the fantasy equivalent of Jack Miller, but it's been a strong off season. Lots of preparation has gone into this year, so I'm like Jack, confident of coming back.
I have to say that I have a similar problem in that I've got 2 different logins for the World Superbike website and the MotoGP website. So it's I have to, I've got 2 separate browsers for watching the 2 different championships, and it's occasionally I forget which one I'm supposed to be watching what on.
Neil, just so you know, cheats never prosper. And also, not only when it comes to Fantasy League, but also trying to, watch some unauthorized video stream.
Well, it's not unauthorized because it's authorized by the man who's commentating on the thing. So,
yeah, it's money out of his own pocket, isn't it?
I was
plus I did his fantasy team for him, so we're even.
Incidentally, on the Patreon channel, we started up a Discord channel. So people who want to sign up and listen to us and suffer our voices can also now read some of our inane comments when we're trying to follow and react to MotoGP action. And Neil, you were asking for our championship predictions at the 11th hour, I might hasten to add, during the weekend. So that was a quick moment of scribbling. But can I just mention that for my championship predictions in MotoGP, I wrote Bagnaia, Binder and Martin. So can post Grand Prix say that I was confused and thought you meant the race order instead of the championship?
Don't worry, we believe you.
Okay, that's important to me. I did also say in Moto 3 there would be Alonso Holgado and Colin Valla, if I said that correctly, David, in Dutch.
Close, very close, very good.
Not bad.
Yeah, Moto 2 was a write-off, but then it was a freaky Grand Prix.
I was going to say, now say Zonta van der Goorberg.
Might need a bit more practice for that one. But yeah, I mean, who did you pick anyway, Neil? Who was your favourite rider? And are you actually going to get things sorted for Portugal?
For my fantasy team?
Your fantasy team, yeah.
Yeah, so I had Bagnaia and Martin, then Acosta and Fernandez, Ducati and Trackhouse was my lineup, which actually is Steve's lineup. So so that did all right for Steve. Steve's obviously having some connection issues currently. And Steve is 121st, so not bad.
Oh, so he's ahead of me. Yeah. I mean, like I chose Raul Fernandez as well, but mostly just because he was cheap and he did very, very well in the test. But then he found a way to completely mess it up in the start. It was
who foresaw that coming?
Yeah, who could have seen that someone would have been a brainless idiot and refused to get off of the start when his bike had a technical issue. And I think in the end that was what ended up costing Aleix Espargaro his issues. Complaining about the tyres because they were on the grid for 7 minutes and they took a long time to get tire warmers on. They don't have the generator, so it's just hot warmers. That's going to change the way it is. And then if you suddenly find yourself in the middle of the pack with and not where you expect it to be, or your tires are going to feel a lot more different. In France, Michelin gave us a hot. I think I've said this before. They gave us a hot tire and a cold tire, and the cold tire is absolutely rock solid, and the hot one it's like putty. It really is. You can bounce it up and down and bend it and twist it into. I mean, you can twist it into a bow tie if you wanted to. That's how much difference the temperature makes.
Neil, when we're talking about predictions, I'm now going to open my shirt, Marc Marquez leather style, and allow you to shoot an arrow straight at me when it comes to a certain favoritism towards an Aprilia rider.
What?
He's. I think he's referring to the
Maverick Vinales.
Yes, his favourites. Yes,
He's been waiting hours. So go on. Go ahead.
What were you?
All he has to do is point. All he has to do is point at the results and point out that. Yeah, I mean, it's Maverick Vinales.
I feel I did my ridicule in last week's show, so there's not really much juice left in the ridicule tank, I'm afraid. But what were you thinking?
Well,
that's all I can say.
I'm keeping the faith. It's been round one, therefore I'm just going to file this away to wait and see. He's still going to be my surprise of the year.
One little anecdote about Maverick Vinales and Pedro Acosta, because we were saying, Pedro looked really disappointed at the start and sounded really disappointed after the sprint race. A long time ago, David Abrivio told me that Maverick Vinales, after his first race on the Suzuki, came into the pits and was crying because he'd expected to win. Now, first of all, that's incredibly unrealistic, but it's also really a sign of how driven these people are. They do expect to win. They do expect to do it. And I think that is the key to success as well, is like expecting to be able to perform and driving yourself to be able to perform.
We were mentioning Pedro Acosta earlier on. We have a special interview for this show, and we're going to run it now with the crew chief, Paul Trevathan. I managed to grab him for 10 minutes after the race Sunday evening. Actually, one of the things I hate about the Qatar GP is the timetabling. I mean, it was a 3 a.m. kind of finish for us by the time we collapsed in the hotel, Neil. But Paul was there packing away with the rest of the Red Bull Gas Tech 3 team, and he was happy to talk to us. So here is that interview. Paul, we're inside the paddock here in Lusail. It's getting packed up. Everybody's pretty busy, so I apologise for dragging you away from the team. You must be feeling pretty chipper at the moment.
Yeah, 100%. to start like that this season with this guy, it's been pretty special. He's the real deal, I have to say. The way he's managed it all, plus the stress of yesterday with having to do all those time attacks and everything else, he kept a level head. He had his little goals that he wanted to set to himself, and he hasn't got ahead of himself. So it's been a great start, to be honest.
Can I ask you what you first thought when you met him? Because you went from having a very established, firm relationship, one of the most experienced riders on the grid, to going to the other end of the scale. So what was your personal thoughts and feelings when they said, Pedro sort of landed in your orbit?
Yeah, I mean, there's the age difference to start with that you sort of think, holy moly. And I've got a daughter 1 year younger than him, and you sort of think, okay, have I got that in me to do that? But what was the clear thing that when we first met was his honesty and his directness and straightness, and that part is something that I really appreciate in all my riders, or even in my general life. I like people who are straight. That's why I live in Holland, for example. So this trait was there straight away. I could see that we could really speak. He was a fantastic listener. He really wanted to be helped. He wanted to learn. So it honestly went much, much easier than I expected. Then our humour side of things is not that far away. You know what I mean? So we can have some fun. And he puts a lot of effort into his craft, And so first of all, I got the respect of how he was as a human. And then the part that come from the riding and the willingness to learn and listen was another part. Like even after Valencia, I was like, oh, okay, this is a little bit too easy. What's happening, So this it's worked really, really well. I think we have a great bond here.
What was your thoughts during the tests? Did you think, okay, you could see the talent was there. I mean, obviously the education had to follow pretty quickly, but was it almost like a case in motocross where you just get the guy the base setting and then he kind of does the rest a little bit of what he understands and how he can manipulate it?
Yeah, I've been in the paddock long enough to see how things happen with rookies, and I would say there's this cycle when you start. What I've seen, that there's a cycle when you start that you try to build the trust up by showing the guy that you can do the job. So what you start to do is start to change everything to make him happy and get him all sorted out, and then he sees that you are willing to work for him, and then you do it, But there's a circle that you should do, in my opinion, because you've got the guy who's going fast on the bike already. So you do this dance around the setting and you try to get back to there as quick as you can. I didn't do the dance at all because I said, here's the bike. This is what it is. I think let's go out there and ride. But he just accepted that and he just took it, and we've not really played with the bike. So because the thing is, I can't quite still believe is that I still don't know where this limit is, because every time he gets on the bike, he just does things better. So, we did the thing in Sepang. I said, okay, let's not touch the bike. Yeah, cool, let's go out. He went out, okay, come back the next day. He said, okay, we've got the base, let's go out on the base bike, do the first run, see what happens. But boom, half a second quicker, you're like, okay, maybe we don't touch the bike again. Yeah, let's just keep working on like this and do. And then the next day, boom, So and we come here on a new track. It was going to be something that was interesting for me to see how we can adapt quickly to a new track at the same time with everyone else. And that was also, unbelievably easy, if you know what I mean. I'm not saying we're expecting to win everything, but you just know that he can adapt, and he, like a great rider, he also understands that the bike will never be perfect.
Is it interesting to see a guy with so many kind of contrasts, because he's so young but seems kind of mature in the way he handles things, but then also he's so inexperienced, but then he's a two-time world champion.
It's bloody mixture that you're sort of thinking, what the hell is this? It's like a guy put together from parts. I call him like an old soul with an old soul with a young body. You know what I mean? But if somebody asked me something today, it was quite interesting. I think it's like he's in the wrong generation. He's probably like us more as kids, you know what I mean, where we only learnt things by doing it, if you know what I mean. He didn't grow up in the modern world of understanding Google, Google and you get the answers of everything. But we, at our time, we did everything, and he sort of got that old worldly type of maturity that you don't find so often in young people anymore. And that part's kind of cool, because you just see this young goofy boy, and then all of a sudden he comes out with some statement, and you're like, damn, where'd that come from, So it is a nice trait that he has, But I guess it's parents, it's upbringing, it's these type of things is sure part of it, But he's a good kid.
Fear stating the bloody obvious. Testing is one thing, but coming to a race weekend is something else. So you must have been curious to see how that will impact him, because even down to the silliness around, such as the extra media attention, the camera duties, everything else, it was another environment for you and Pedro to work in and to discover.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, for sure the media thing is a big impact on him, because it's like, whoa, that's a lot of people asking a lot of stuff and a lot of time, you know. So I think he would have, especially the first Grand Prix, there was a lot of interest, and his day was just completely packed on the Thursday, and I could see that starting to get its toll on him a little bit, you know, and the fact that he wanted to be more in the box, talking about how we're going to do things and everything like that. But then he can switch from this professional to go and do it and come back, you know. And we look at each other and we're like, okay, all good, and we're like, yeah, okay, now we can go, you know. And this weekend was a seriously tough weekend for all of us, because we had the rain, we had the PR, you know, the having to do all those time attacks in a row is not easy for even the most experienced, because it is stressful, you know. The people from it was vicious, you know. I mean, I had a new data guy, I got a new tyre guy. They had to go through all that like the rider, and you could see the look in their eyes like, fucking hell, you know. And yeah, everyone was super nervous, but Pedro not. Pedro was super calm, and he just did his thing, you know. He said it was mentally tiring that day, much more than he could have imagined, but he said it was fantastic also, because he used it like a training. He said, I got all these shots of new tyres and I just got better and better. So
Paul, obviously we saw the race and we saw how much fun it was. I mean, Pedro was the person making things happen, but I'm curious to know emotionally, and you know, just as an exercise in professionalism for you, how was it? I mean, you must have been there watching the monitor. It must have been hard to sort of, I don't know, were you worried at some points, or were you excited? How did you deal with it?
I think I probably had the biggest smile on my face I've had for a long time, you know. It was just really nice to watch, you know. It was like a kid out there, and you saw these big names, and he was just out there. I don't think he was trying to show the world. He was just out there being Pedro, you know, and it made me laugh and smile. Worried, I just wanted him to do what he wanted to do and come back and be heap proud of himself, you know. That was the only thing that I didn't want anything stupid to happen in that sense. But for the rest of it was a really enjoyable race to watch, you know. And yeah, it looked like he was having some fun.
Obviously, you had testing mileage here. Yep. That was a nice bedding in period. Sure. Do you think Portimao could be maybe tougher?
I mean, Portimao on a MotoGP bike is tough. You know, it's a physical, it's all the blinds. I would say that one and Austin would probably be the two toughest races to go to as an experienced guy on the MotoGP bike. So and they're both coming up next, exactly. So this part, I mean, like I said, I don't know what this kid what he can really do yet. You know, it's like I set a goal to get out of Sepang at a certain lap time. You know, he smashed that in the shakedown. So you're sort of like, okay, so what are we going to do now? And that's the part that I keep getting surprised by. So I don't expect it to be a walk in the park, either does he, but we go there with the idea of working our way through it and try to get there, you know.
It might be a bit of a silly question, but I saw the basis of your relationship with Paul founded on trust. Again, a good humanistic kind of relationship, but then also maximum effort. Yeah. Do you kind of see the seeds potentially of that again?
Yeah, I really do. You know, I mean, you know, everyone in this paddock is talented. You know, when you get to MotoGP, you're unbelievably talented. You're the best riders in the world. I've got so much respect for anyone who sits their leg over that and does that. But there's something different in some of them, you know. I've had the pleasure of being in the Repsol Honda box for some years and working with Danny and having Casey on the other side of the garage, and then Mark coming in and seeing these guys who are real champions and how they, little details of how they do things, you know. And you think, fuck, you know, the dedication, the commitment, and I have to say I see it again, you know. I really do. And if you make it or you don't is another story. But the work ethic, the way, the amount of want he wants, the reasoning why he's here, all these little conversations we have and stuff is, it is good to see. So I really do see, like you said, I love trust. I love, you know, I'm a guy, if I'm working, but if I'm having fun, I'm having fun, you know. And I like that trust and that human side of the job. And if I can have that and you have somebody as quick as this and with that potential, it should be a nice story, I think.
Speaking of Paul, did he pop by on his new role and put you under the microphone? I mean, surely that's the time when you can give him some tips, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I see a happy Paul. You know, I see Paul is a great friend, you know. I would even say a family member in our family sort of thing. So seeing him happy, seeing him healthy is a really beautiful thing. So, you know, I know he misses riding a motorcycle, but he did tell me also he doesn't miss having a Saturday like that and putting all that stress and pressure on himself again, you know. So I'm glad that he's super fit, and what we saw in Sepang, he was back to being the Paul that we know. He was fast, he was smiling, and this is really, really nice to see. We had a bloody tough year last year, and it wasn't nice to see a friend go through that. So really good to see him taking that role and enjoying life.
Paul, thanks ever so much for your time. I'll let you get back to packing up, and we'll catch each other in Portugal.
No worries, mate. Thank you.
Okay, good to get the inside line there on Pedro Acosta's debut Grand Prix. We talked about him enough in this podcast. Now let's wrap things up with our winners and losers. Dave, over to you first. Who was your victor from the Lusail International Circuit?
My winner from the Lusail International Circuit was Marc Marquez, for all of the reasons that I laid out previously. He's on course. He's on course to be champion this year.
My winner, I'm going to say KTM. Purely because, again, some of the reasons we've mentioned. I mean, things are not looking so great for Jack, but then, Brad Binder is in a strong position. This circuit has not been terribly easy for the factory in the past, but they were competitive. They were right there, to the tune of a second behind the GP24 with the world champion. And also, I think 3 of their bikes were in the top 4 when it comes to the top speed charts as well. So that only implies top speed, but also acceleration as well out of the final turn at Lusail. So, things seem to be going well for the Austrians. I'm going to nominate them as my winners. Neil?
Yeah. Just really quickly on the Austrians, we sort of mentioned how there was 11-second improvement in the sprint from last year to this year. Top Ducati was Martin last year, top Ducati Martin this year in the sprint. KTM, Binder was the top KTM in both last year and this year's sprint. 16 seconds faster he was, which is an absurd step forward over 11 laps. So KTM definitely look like they're closer to the front. My winner for the weekend is the winner of the MotoGP race, world champion Pecco Bagnaia. We mentioned it briefly earlier, but I just thought it was a very controlled, almost ominous display of kind of dominance from him. I mean, Binder, I don't think at any point was 1.3 seconds closer to him, during the race. Yet there was an air of inevitability to the result almost as soon as Bagnaia hit the front. It was essentially the 2023 Pecco that was okay on Friday, okay on Saturday, but was just devastating on Sunday, and kind of had found a way to basically exploit the kind of the weaknesses of the others, and he knew exactly what he had to do in his opening lap salvo. I mean, he was 5th on the grid, but he was, I think, 3rd going into turn 2, 1st coming out of turn 4. I mean, it was just a really, really ruthless opening to the race, and he did exactly what he had to do. So respect to the number 1.
When it comes to losers, I think I'm going to nominate Luca Marini, again, for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier. And it was just also interesting watching Luca's demeanor throughout the weekend. There was a sense of optimism on Thursday. He looked pretty kind of haunted on Friday. Saturday as well, you were slightly worried, but then he was kind of back to his usual slightly happy-go-lucky self on Sunday. Looked quite bemused as well at the fact that he was almost 3 seconds a lap off the pace. I mean, Marini, that name was just rooted at the bottom of the time screens. He said he had an issue in the race and wouldn't really talk much more about it. But he also preached patience and calm. This is just the beginning of his HRC story. And, well, if there's anything, he might have the satisfaction of being able to turn around this big, huge behemoth of a motorcycle racing factory. But, we know that HRC are not renowned for their flexibility. So you do wonder how much more progress is going to be made. Joan Mir was talking a bit about the Jerez test. Honda could potentially have some new bits and pieces that might improve things slightly there. But, I'm going to say Luca just for the pretty dismal situation that it seemed to be. Neil, your loser? Oh, sorry, Dave, you wanted to say something?
I mean, about how fast Honda could turn it around. I mean, they built a completely new bike between the Misano test last year and the Valencia test last year, which was a space of basically 2 months. So they are fully aware of the situation that they're in, and I think that's reason for optimism.
Neil, your loser?
My loser is Marco Bezzecchi, one of the stars of last year, 3rd in the championship on a year-old machine. He was nowhere near what we know he's capable of all weekend. We thought there was progress from Bezzecchi during the Qatar test. Sepang was obviously a bit of a disaster, but some of his comments over the weekend suggested this is no easy fix. And I think there was quite an alarming comment on Saturday evening where he told us that he kind of had listened back to some of the things that Enea Bastianini was saying about the GP23 last year. And he was thinking, yeah, that's pretty much exactly how I feel. Bezzecchi is so strong as he breaks, kind of trail breaks into the corner, but the engine character of the GP23 is not allowing him to kind of enter with the speed that he wants to. It's kind of almost pushing the front end, and negating his big strength. And yeah, I mean, his results were quite poor. He was 11th in the sprint, 14th in the main race. And I don't want to rush to conclusions, but it already looks like this could be a season where he's thinking, what did I do when he turned down the chance of having a GP24? Being loyal is great and everything, but ultimately you have to be completely ruthless and think for number one. Would Valentino Rossi have put his team manager and mentor first over his own prospects when he was in the kind of Bezzecchi stage of his own career? I pretty much would assert he would not. So, how long until Bezzecchi is kind of ruined? Maybe he's already ruined that decision to reject the 23, reject the 24 bike.
Yeah, the problem is it's not easily fixable because it's a question of engine character. Bezzecchi doesn't get on with the engine character. He can't ride the way that he wants to with this engine character. You can't change the engine, so he's stuck with it for the rest of the year. So he has to adapt himself and change the style. And the question is, can he do that?
Dave, who was your Pirelli Moto 2 rubber of the Grand Prix?
I think Pirelli did a fantastic job. I really enjoyed it, and it really spiced the racing up. I think the Moto 2 is going to be much more interesting this year. My loser was, actually, speaking about there's a whole bunch of Moto 2 riders I could have chosen, but I'm going to go for Jorge Martin because even though he won the sprint race, even though he ended up on the podium, he did exactly what he did all last year, which is win the sprint race when there's only 12 points up for grabs, and then lose the main race when there's 25 points up for grabs. So that is a recipe for doing really, really well and finishing second again. He needs to win the long races. That's his big problem. He said he was trying to save his tyre at the beginning and didn't want to push too hard. But Pecco understood that you need to get out front and then you manage the tyre. That was what Bagnaia did much better than Martin. And again, Martin needs to make a step here if he wants to be champion.
Martin's best opening night performance of the last 5 years, Dave, 15th place. So I would suggest that a sprint victory, pole position, and third is actually a pretty decent return for Martin on the opening night of the season. I do take your point though, and he did say that he thinks had Pecco not got him off on the first lap, it could have panned out a bit differently. But yeah, I think it's like Marquez, it's a solid base to start from.
It's a solid base, but it's the same error in strategy as from last year, and for me, that's the decisive failure here.
Steve is definitely the loser on this podcast. I think that's what you get for having a puppy that chews through the internet cable. But we hope he'll be back. Of course, he's going to be back in action soon for the second round of Superbike. We have Superbike, MXGP, and MotoGP all on the same weekend, all on the same peninsula in 2 weeks' time. So that's a good bit of coordination there amongst the promoters for the markets. US listeners or US-based listeners, how was your experience of MotoGP with the new TV rights deal? Had a cool message actually from Daniel Simondo giving us an update saying live sprints and main races are going to be happening on True TV. And I think that gives them also access to the Bleacher Report. So, a whole sort of new potential demographic in the US. Send us some comments either on Twitter or through Patreon or through SoundCloud. Let us know how it was watching this round of MotoGP. I think it was actually prime time on Monday. So that was, some pretty good stuff for US-based listeners. We're going to be back next week with a preview pod for Portimao. Dave, you're in Portugal already? It must be lovely to be around that wonderful sunny climate, but are you slightly sad that you don't have your BMW with you?
God, yes. As I was actually cruising down the, even though it's not spectacular scenery, but it's quite charming. The sort of the way that the hills roll around on the motorway from Lisbon down to Portimao. I really wish I could come down here on a motorbike, but it's about 2,700 kilometers, and that's a lot of riding. It's still it's still on my bucket list, but it's not going to happen for the next couple of years.
And knowing how you drive, Dave, I'm sure you definitely were cruising, coming away from the airport down to your accommodation. Now, what's your plan for the weekend before we fly out to Lisbon?
Some bicycle riding, I think, maybe somewhere up in the north of Catalonia. Could be a nice, way to unwind after a hectic couple of weeks. And then I think we're on the same flight on Wednesday for Portimao. So yeah.
Yeah, we'll try to get the podcast recorded next Tuesday and published online as soon as we can. Maybe Steve can join us. Maybe not, we'll see. Thanks for listening, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this one. Episode 390. We'll be back next week.